Hi everyone, I'm Lara from Not Enough Knitting, and today I'm going to teach you about gauge and why gauge is important in a knitting pattern. And the first question is, what is gauge? So gauge is the amount of stitches you have and amount of rows you have in an inch square piece of your fabric. However, many designers will design their patterns and many yarn suppliers will put on their yarn the gauge in a 4" by 4" square piece of fabric. It's just a lot easier to measure your gauge in a little bit bigger piece of fabric. Okay, so the next question is, what is a swatch? So if you are an avid knitter, again, you're going to know what a swatch is. And if you are a beginner knitter, you will just be becoming familiar with the term swatch. So a swatch is a rectangular piece of knitting that you will do to knit as a test before you start your knitting pattern. And why would you do the swatch? Well, you might want to look to see if you like the yarn that you're using, see how it holds up in the pattern, but most importantly, you do the swatch to test your gauge. And so the pattern that you use to test your gauge will be determined by the knitting designer, and they will use the pattern that will most perfectly align with the pattern that you are going to be knitting to make sure that your gauge is right and that your garment or whatever you're knitting will turn out to be the right size. So as you can tell here, I have knit two different test swatches, and these were done with the basic stockinette stitch pattern. So the next question is, why is gauge so important? So I'm going to give you an example. If I wanted to knit a sweater in which the circumference would be 30 inches when it was finished, and if I look at the pattern and the gauge was 18 stitches per 4 inches, and so if I think about that, I would need 135 stitches to have 30 inches for a circumference of this sweater. So the designer would have designed the pattern so it ends up with 135 stitches. So if I didn't do a swatch and didn't measure my gauge and I started knitting and I ended up with a stitch count of 20 stitches per 4 inches, it doesn't seem like a lot that we're out by 2 stitches per 4 inches, but over that 135 stitches, it ends up being 3 inches that we're out. Our sweater would be 27 inches instead of 30 inches. So you would end up with a sweater that probably would be a little bit too snug. And when you put in all that effort to knit this sweater that takes many hours, it is awesome when it turns out to be the right size. Now we'll go back to these two swatches that I have knit. So these swatches are done in stockinette stitch, and they're actually the same amount of stitches across and the same amount of rows that I knit. And as you can tell, they're two totally different sizes. So I would have knit this one with a smaller needle and this one with a larger needle. So if you look, this one is quite a bit, the width is quite a bit shorter and the length is also shorter than this one. So if I were to use these two different needle sizes that I use to knit these swatches and knit the same sweater, I would come out with two totally different size sweaters. So that's why it's important that we measure our gauge and get the right amount of stitches and rows per inch. Okay, so the next question is, how do we measure our gauge? So I'm going to use these swatches that I did in stockinette, and you can tell we're going to count the stitches across this way, and you can tell where each stitch is. So use your ruler, and with these ones, I'm going to do 3 inches just for comparison because this swatch is so little. Okay, so I measure out my 3 inches here, and I'm now going to count my stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So that's 17 stitches in 3 inches. So now if I compare it to this one, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to count these and look how much bigger this one is. Okay, so I'm gonna use my ruler, and now let's count our 3 inches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So we have 14 stitches instead of 17, so that's quite a difference. So then to measure the row gauge, we're gonna count this way, vertically now. We're gonna count how many stitches we have vertically. So let's use our ruler again. I'm gonna do 3 inches. And we're going to count each of these stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. So this has 25 rows in 3 inches. So then if I'm going to count this one here, I expect it'll be smaller, or less number of rows, but let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. So this one's 22 and this one was 25. So quite a bit different. So that would be my gauge for both of these. So last question is, what do I do when my gauge is not the same as the gauge in the pattern? Now this is a very good question. So if you knit your swatch and you realize that it's too small, it does not match the gauge. So in this case, let's just use this as an example. So we had 17 stitches per 3 inches. So the gauge of our pattern, let's say, was 18 stitches per 4 inches. So this is way too tight. We did 18 stitches in 4 inches and we got 17 stitches in 3 inches. So what I would do in this case is that I would up my needle size a few sizes because it's quite a bit different than the actual gauge, and then I would knit it again. So I up my needle size and I knit this. So this one actually is 18 stitches per 4 inches. So this would be perfect. So then I would be like, great, now my stitch count is perfect. And then I would measure my row count and see if it's the same row count also as the gauge. And in this case, it was. So this one is 26 rows per 4 inches. And that's what the pattern had required. So when I went from something that was too small, I needed to increase my needle size to get the right gauge. So now let's say that we knit our gauge. So our gauge is going to change. So now in the pattern, it says we need 20 stitches per 4 inches. And in this case, we have 18 stitches per 4 inches. Now what do we do? Okay, so we have too few stitches. So our needles that we're using are too large. So we need to drop a needle size. So it's not out too much, like it's out 2 stitches. So we could try dropping 1 needle size and knit the same thing again. And that way we can check to see if we have the same gauge as in the pattern. And then we would also count our rows and verify that our rows are the same as well on the gauge. So as you knit, you will realize that you are either a tight knitter or a loose knitter. And so like most knitting designers will design their patterns based on the average knitter. And so the more you knit, you will realize that you either have to increase your needle size to get the right gauge or to decrease your needle size to get the right gauge. Or you might be the average knitter and you always get gauge with the required needles. But at least once you figure out your tension, it gives you a starting point and then you can go from there. Okay, well, I hope that this has helped you and hopefully that you will be able to figure out the correct gauges.